Hello students, this will be a continuing lecture in the prehistory of Cook Inlet. This will be the marine Kachemak tradition. In your packet on Blackboard will be a related lecture having to do with Frederica de Laguna, who defined the Kachemak tradition, and particularly the marine Kachemak tradition. So before you watch this, it would be helpful to watch the lecture on Frederica de Laguna and how she did some of the pioneering work in archaeology in Cook Inlet and really in North America, defining the Kachemak tradition. So this is the broad sweep of prehistory for the Kenai Peninsula, and much of it will apply to the upper inlet as well. This is Sitna area. It gets a little fuzzier as we get over into the Lake Clark area, so this applies primarily to Cook Inlet area. We talked in an earlier lecture on the earlier cultures of the area. Now we're going to focus on the better known cultures of the area, this one on the marine Kachemak tradition. Then we will have a lecture on the riverine Kachemak tradition. I know that's a little bit of a contradiction, but we'll define that. And then the Dena'ina, particularly the sedentary Dena'ina, in terms of archaeology. Recall the radiocarbon dates are from this suite of dates, and this is how we know how old things are. We don't know as much about the earlier dates, but these are pretty well established. The marine Kachemak tradition will date from about 1000 BC to around 1000 AD, although there's some question about these later dates. There's only one date. It's about from 900 AD. It's possible that that's an outlier and that this ends here around 700 AD or so. So more work will clarify that, but for now we'll say it goes from 1000 BC to around 700 to 1000 AD. This is a closer version of the same thing, and now we can talk about the relationship of the marine Kachemak tradition, riverine Kachemak tradition, and subsequent ethnohistoric cultures to climate. One way to understand climate is in terms of glacial advances and retreats. As you know, glaciers are sensitive to climate change. Right now, most glaciers, not all, but most glaciers are retreating in relation, at least in Alaska, to global warming conditions. And the same has been in the past, although as far as we know, those were not anthropogenic caused climate change, but natural climate change due to various cycles. Work has been done on the Gruink Glacier and the McCarty Glacier. The McCarty Glacier is on the Seward or Prince William side of the Kenai Peninsula, and the Gruink Glacier is in Kachemak Bay, so it has more of a terrestrial landlocked characteristic to it, whereas the McCarty Glacier flows into the ocean, so it has that effect. So these are advances based on till, based on the analysis of organic material in till, and that coincides with the early medieval advance right here, and then a retreat. Harder to date the retreats because the harder to find the material. The McCarty Glacier began then advancing earlier than the Gruink Glacier, and it's not surprising to have the tidewater glaciers acting a little different from the on-land glaciers, so glacial geologists tell me. Either way, this coincides with the medieval optimum, so this advance here is a worldwide medieval optimum. And then there was a little ice age in here, and then a retreat, and we're back to warm periods now. So this point right in here is key. Key for the riverine Kachemak tradition Dena'ina interface may have had an impact in the marine Kachemak end, but also it may be this early medieval advance that's a factor. These are all questions that we ask and need to be worked out. We're getting more and more data. Someday somebody will do some serious work on these these questions, and we'll know more about the response of cultures to climate change. This medieval advance, by the way, is particularly intriguing because I have seen relatively rare, but in my over 40 years here, times when Kachemak Bay, for example, was entirely frozen over. Not for long periods of time. I think it lasted about a week or something like that. But if that were to have occurred all winter, one could imagine some devastating effects on shellfish, and shellfish being relatively low on the food chain, having some corresponding effects further up the food chain, and of course having a potential effect on people. The ice essentially scouring out the mussel beds and similar things. So those are the types of data we'd like and the types of questions we'd like to answer. But for now, we know that we've got to start around 1000 BC, ending somewhere in this time range. So this is a map of the marine Kachemak area, approximately 500 AD. So it's in this area here. This is, of course, Kachemak Bay right here. The riverine Kachemak tradition occurred, the marine Kachemak tradition, in Kodiak Island. That might have been its heartland. In the fjorded coastline here up into Prince William Sound, and on parts of the Alaska Peninsula. Correspondingly, at the same or contemporaneously, the riverine Kachemak tradition occurred in the upper inlet areas. These are approximate areas where there's a few sites up in this area, for example, so they're not extensive. There's one on Custatan. So, they're here and there, but it probably looks something like this. A Norton culture exists in this area. This interface here might slide one way or the other as further work and further analysis proceeds. And I've identified the proto-Denina, that would be the pre-Denina, as being in this area, especially in this Kuskokwim area, the borderlands up in this area. And we'll see subsequent movements down into the more traditional homeland. So these all raise interesting questions of culture history. What happened to the marine Kachemak tradition? What happened to the riverine tradition? Why did the Denina move in? What happened to the Norton tradition as it transitioned into Yupik culture? All of these are important questions. We'll learn more about them. So our focus now will be on the marine Kachemak tradition. So some of the key points, it was defined by Frederica de Laguna, and as I mentioned at the outset, you should watch that short lecture on her, and she's a worthwhile person to learn more about. So she did some of the first problem-oriented archaeology in North America, and certainly in Alaska, and defined the Kachemak tradition. The subsistence was marine mammals, fish, shellfish, intertidal plants, a marine orientation, unlike the riverine, which was primarily an interior river salmon fishing culture. So the sites are located where they could optimally harvest those foods, and I'll show you a picture on the next slide showing that orientation. And the marine Kachemak sites in Cook Inlet and Kodiak are mostly on the fjorded coastline. So the fjords, the bays and inlets are important in understanding the adaptation of the marine Kachemak tradition. Here's a site on Chugachik Island. It's at the head of Kachemak Bay. It was excavated by Bill Workman and Jack Lebdell in the 80s. This is the site area here. This is almost 10 feet of midden. Midden is a sort of a catch-all term for combination of artifacts, features, bones, living material, People live, they throw things out, it builds up, and eventually a midden develops. In the Middle East, the term tell is commonly associated with cities, Tel Aviv and Tel this and Tel that, and that's because as areas have been occupied for thousands of years, the whole area builds up. I read somewhere that Chicago is about 12 feet higher in elevation than it was in 1900. Same reason, buildings get torn down, areas get filled in, it builds up. So that's the living area, and this is the intertidal zone. This was a field trip I took with students from Kenai Peninsula College a number of years ago in the spring, and we went to see many of the important sites in Kachemak Bay. We found a lot of artifacts, not too many, on the beach, and I want to emphasize we picked them up, we photographed them, and we put them back, complying with state law. The State Antiquities Act and other acts apply to the intertidal zone, and the state owns that intertidal zone. So we, unless I have a permit, even though I'm an archaeologist, unless I have a permit, I can't pick up artifacts and just stick them in my pocket and walk off with them. I have to have a research plan, and we have to have a use for them. The same on land. If it's state land, the same legislation applies. You cannot excavate without a permit. Same with federal land. There's federal legislation that applies. So you cannot collect artifacts without a permit, and permits only go to archaeologists who have a reason for doing the excavation. The reason for this legislation is to prevent looting and the trafficking of artifacts, which would then encourage further looting of sites, and eventually sites would become destroyed, and that legacy of our past would be gone. So we try to prevent that. There's lots of archaeology to be done in Cook Inlet and throughout Alaska and throughout North America and the world, and if we can prohibit the destruction of sites for future knowledge and future generations, that's what we should do. So I'm standing on the site here, Marine Kachemak again. I'm looking toward the mainland. So this is an island, this is the intertidal zone, and at low tide, absolutely low tide, I think you can almost walk to the mainland from Chukachik Island, and then of course it floods. And this is an area of intense biomass, and this is where sea mammals come to feed, and this is where the people's site was, so that they could intercept some of those sea mammals for food. So this is the location. The term is used in archaeology, an optimal foraging hypothesis. You're going to position yourself, and in this case the village is going to be where you have optimal food resources. And we'll see later that those resources will be sea mammals, shellfish, probably sea plants, and fish. And that's why the site is where it is. This is a map of an excavation I did with the college and the Pratt Museum between 1987 and 1990. It's at the point west of Halibut Cove. It's located right here. This is the fjorded coastline, and most of the sites, not all, but most of the sites are on that fjorded coastline and then out around. It came about this way. A man had bought the property that I'm about to show you, and he was a wealthy guy, and he wanted to build a summer home there, and he had some workers putting in a water line, and they kept running into artifacts. So he went over to the Pratt Museum, and asked if they had any materials, and they pointed him to the Archaeology of Cook Inlet, Frederica de Laguna, and he began looking through the book and found that in fact a picture of that very island that he owned and a description of the site was there. So he contacted the museum staff. Betsy Pitzman was the director at the time, and Martha Madsen was involved, and said, if you want to excavate there, then go ahead, but I want to start building in the fall. So this was in the spring, and so they called me, and I get quite a few calls like that. I'm pretty sure every anthropologist, archaeologist in Alaska does get those kind of calls. So I knew, of course, about the work. I didn't know of this exact site, or at least I didn't remember it, the work of De Laguna. So I looked it up, and I read this. On the mainland, just west of the entrance behind Ismailoff Island, is a small rocky point a few hundred yards long. On the southern slope is a midden with a maximum depth of 6 or 7 feet. At the upper end of the midden, on the western shore of the western side of the island, is a house pit. The stratification suggests 2 distinct periods of habitation and 2 distinct cultures. The younger is undoubtedly Indian, while the older part of the midden is Eskimo. So there's De Laguna's picture. There's the site area right there, and what she had found in some limited testing in the 1930s was a stratigraphic situation where you have the Eskimo, or what she ended up calling the Kachemak tradition, below, and Dena'ina above. So this, of course, was related directly to her hypothesis. She hypothesized that stratigraphic relationship. But not a lot of work had been done on when that happened. When did that interface occur? And so this was a prime opportunity to gather more information related to that question. So that became our hypothesis, or our question. When did the break between the marine Kachemak tradition and the Dena'ina occur at this particular site? So we were really after identifying those 2 periods, and then charcoal or some other datable material, but it turned out to be charcoal, whereby we could determine when that temporal shift occurred. So here's an aerial view of the site. This is where we did the work, and all of the work that I'm about to show you ended up in a publication in 1992, The Archaeology of the Point West of Halibut Cove, in the Anthropological Papers of the University of Alaska. So this is the site. This is the house depression, the one that De Laguna correctly identified as Dena'ina, or Indian. And it's built into, this is looking from the top down, built into this Kachemak tradition site. You will note that there's a utility pole. Homer Electric Association put some poles in the area for locals for electricity, and inadvertently put one right smack in the middle of the house. If they would have been about 5 feet further to the north, they would have put the pole right through the hearth, and we would have not been talking about this today. They would have undoubtedly disturbed the hearth. So this was not, they didn't do this intentionally, but they, the pole now becomes a point of reference for us. You will see the title here is Calhoun's Point. It was locally called Calhoun's Point. Official site designation is Seldovia 010. We then changed the designation to Point West of Halibut Cove. Same thing Frederica De Laguna did to keep consistency. Should have just started with that. So here we're laying out the grid, cutting down the nettle and the fireweed. There you see the utility pole. So we're standing in the house. This is Marsh Pitzman, and this is Janet Klein, and we're getting ready to bring volunteers over to start excavation. And here is some of that excavation. We essentially bisected the house and dug through the house into the lower marine Kachemak below. Here is that trench. I had a wide angle lens. I have to. The trench is actually straight, but archaeologists look at this and say, "Boy, it digs crooked." Um, so this on the picture on the left, a nice sunny day, and on the right, occasionally it does get a little wet in Kachemak Bay, but you got to roll with the punches and deal with it as it comes. Here's we stayed in a camp. We had about 20 people working on it. It was a really remarkable effort by the Pratt Museum. All volunteers, local folks. They just put out a call. Are you interested in working for a couple of weeks or whatever it might be at on the other side of the bay? And those that could came over. Here's David Rode and Wendy Erd. We stayed at a church camp that was about a mile up the beach, and that was great. It was great to be able to go and sleep in a cabin in the night rather than in a tent. Here's the site then. That's the house with contour maps, contour lines, pardon me. And so the trench bisected this way. And here's a picture of that trench, and here's a cross section. So the house went from here to here, and here's the hearth right here, and that corresponds to this hearth right here. And so this is Denina, and below this white, that's all shell, is the midden from the marine Kachemak part. We found only one artifact in the upper zone that we attributed, or at least I did, to Denina, and that was this adze. That's typical. We learned, I was learning that then, and it's still true, relatively few artifacts are found in Denina sites, not because they didn't have artifacts, but they were very careful with the disposal of artifacts because of a concept called bagesh. Information that is associated with the artifact that could convey negative information to animals and others. So Denina will develop that point very completely later on. So below is the midden. That's the marine Kachemak tradition. So we were interested in finding carbon. We'd collected a lot of carbon, and we pinpoint exactly where it's from, and then we sent it off, some of it. We only had money for 4 dates to a lab. So the oldest date is down here, and that dated at AD 36. We sent a date from the upper end of the midden here, and that dated at 915 AD. Then for the Denina area, we sent 2 dates from the hearth, 418 AD and AD 1260. So this was good information. This was what we wanted to find. This was what we wanted to learn. So based on this site, we would say that the marine people lived there from 0 AD to about 1000 AD, give or take. And it might have been a little less than that. And then the Denina move in. And those dates reflect a very consistent set of dates from 1000 AD on up to about 1800 AD. So we gathered good information. It worked out, and it certainly was worth it. This was the one artifact. It's an adze that was from the Denina area. It would have been hafted onto a handle, a wooden handle, lashed onto a wooden handle. This is the pounding end, like you pound with a sledgehammer, and that's the splitting end you could use to split spruce or maybe crack open bone, other types of things. It was the only artifact we found, but in the rest of the area, about down below, we found literally thousands of artifacts. So here we have a little bit on data collection. Here's Kathy Smith, who's got 3 bags in front of her. One is for artifacts, one is for bone, and one is for shell. The bone and the shell, of course, will reflect diet, and the artifacts will reflect culture and use. And the other thing is features. Features are things you can't put in a bag and take back to a lab with you. So a feature would be a hearth, or maybe posts that held up a building or something like that. So the artifacts included, just kind of scan through all of these, a lot of harpoons, both barbed harpoons and toggling harpoons. Here's a little inset that I lifted off from the Smithsonian showing a barbed harpoon as it would be used on a sea mammal. And this is a toggling harpoon. It goes in and the line is offset, so it twists or toggles and it can't come out. In both cases then the line is attached to a float, much like the orange buoys that fishermen use, and it's tossed overboard, and since it's a sea mammal, the sea mammal dives and is pulling this heavy weight through the water equal to the weight of the water it displaces, and has to come up for air. It's given another shot and dives again. Now it's dragging two of those floats, maybe a couple 100 pounds, through the water. Eventually tires out, it's dispatched and brought home. If you spear a sea mammal directly, it will sink and die and you won't get it. So harpoons, both barbed and toggling harpoons, are a key artifact in a marine mammal adaptation, and we find them, of course, here at this marine Kachemak site. Ulus, these are broken, most of them. It's not unusual. People make artifacts, they use them, they break them, they discard them, they make new ones, and so often what we find at an archaeological site are broken artifacts. Same is true here with slate points and knives. Slate is a very common raw material for making tools in Cook Inlet because it's readily available and readily workable. There is chipstone, not as much. The reddish one in the lower right is natural chert from Kachemak Bay, and the other cherts are probably traded in. These are abraders, which would have been used for working wood and probably those very slate artifacts. These are scoria. You can see the grooves in here, probably from shaping maybe arrows, I don't know. This is a material of naturally fired claystone, which would have been used to sharpen. You can see the grooves in there. And so essentially what we have here is fine-grained, medium grit, and coarse grit sandpaper. Various mauls and hammerstones. This one would have been held in the hand, and you can see the bashing at the end where it was used for pounding. Same on these two, but these grooves indicate these were hafted or lashed onto a handle and used for pounding. These are bone points, arrow points probably. These are not stones, which are used as net weights to hold a net in the water. You will hear a lot about not stones when we talk about the riverine Kachemak tradition. And at the bottom are these large boulder spalls, which would have been very effective, we know, in fleshing sea mammals and other hides. Various types of handles and wedges made out of bone, and awls and needles for sewing, sewing being critical. And when you have a marine adaptation, to be able to sew a waterproof seam is critical to that. So these awls would have been used in sewing. And here's on the far right is an ivory needle. Not a very good picture, I apologize, but every bit as functional as a modern needle. Very small eye of the needle and very sharp point, and you could sew with that today as easily as you could sew with a metal needle. Here's a lamp that we found, broken. This was found, of course, in the marine Kachemak part of the site. Highly decorated, finely chipped granite, and broken. And you see these two projections here. That's a typical Kachemak tradition style. Here's a picture of some artifacts, similar lamps that were found whole on Kodiak Island. These two projections, archaeologists, I would say mostly male archaeologists, have interpreted those to be breasts, and they may be. Frederica de Laguna, however, she vehemently felt they were not breasts, that they were volcanoes. So I'll let you consider the source and make your decision. Other stone lamps, remarkable objects. Sometimes you hear, well, there's no native art from Cook Inlet. Well, that's not true. These are just remarkable lamps, huge, 60, 70 pounds, faces, chipped out. We haven't really appreciated some of the art we have here. That's really the question. Here is a lamp that was found by a young man on the beach. I found out about it, and I talked to him, and he agreed to have the Comanche tribe talk with him and the people from the Pratt Museum. We encouraged him to donate it to the museum on the premise that history belongs to all of us. He vacillated on it for a number of years, 5 years or maybe more, and then finally he decided to put it on loan in the Pratt Museum. So as far as I know, it's still there, and you could go and see it today. But it almost became part of a private collection. Labrets on the bottom, very typical of Yupik and Inupiaq areas, Analutic areas, beads, and then unusual, I'm not sure what this disc-like thing is. These are some more labrets that De Laguna found in her excavation, and other various pieces of jewelry that would have been used. We've also found some small carvings. I'm not sure what this is, perhaps a caribou head or something. This is a seal. If you turn it in your hand, it's ivory. And these are two of these claystone carvings. This is a male figure and with a face, and the smaller one is female, and she doesn't have a face carved. Here's a closer picture of it. Very small, as small as the tip of my little finger. I was writing notes and watching on a sunny day when the Erd was working, and I was kind of thinking off to myself, and I saw her sit back, and she kind of looked at something in her hand for the longest time, and finally she came over and she said, "I think I found a little lady." And what a beautiful way to express that. And so I affectionately think of her as the Venus of Halibut Cove, and of the similar to the famous Venus figurines of Far East, Near East, pardon me, and the fact that she has no face perhaps makes her even more beguiling. Rock art, famous, well-known rock art. These are from De Laguna's book, and they're dark black images, but the originals would have been painted with that same claystone, fired claystone, in a reddish hue. Lance Peterson did some testing, and he would take some of that chalk rock, you can find it on the beach quite readily, ground it up, mixed it with water, got the red color is rust or iron oxide, got the iron oxide oxidation going, and he'd mix it with oil and daub it onto a rock, and it would eventually rust its way into the rock, creating this image. And that's probably how they did it. Some of them we know, or we think we know. This is a killer whale. This may be a caribou of some sort. But others we don't know. We don't know what this meant to the people, and that's a mystery we may never know. This is a particularly interesting one. People see a boat. I see a boat. 5 oars, 4 people, 1 ascending spirit. Kachemak Bay and Cook Inlet are bad water. Difficult water. Difficult water today. Difficult water even more so if you're using a skin boat. This is a set of rock paintings in Sadie Cove. A man, I guess it was a man, I don't know who, went there with a chisel and a hammer and tried to break out the rock to take this home with him. And in so doing, he ended up shattering the rock, so that's destroyed. Another one that's been destroyed are the paintings in Bear Island, another field trip. Took students on, and what we found is this. This is the image that De Laguna recorded, and this is what we found. Somebody had put some kind of substance on it, like he or she were trying to remove the substance, and in a process destroyed it. So who owns history, and should it be protected? And because now I can't take you to these places, you can't see them in their original. They're destroyed, and greed will destroy unless we take some steps to try to protect important sites. Well, let's talk about faunal remains. Fauna meaning animals, of course, and what they ate in terms of faunal remains. Lee Post and Betsy Pitzman did a remarkable job of analyzing the faunal remains at this site. I think they analyzed over 1,000 bones, and we found much more than that, but we took a sample, a random sample, for them to analyze. Lee did most of the work, but Betsy helped where she could. So here's their journal, here's their recording notebook, and I then put it on a computer, the site, the square, the level, the identifier, the date, and in this case, what it is, it's a mammal, it's a seal, it's a femur, it's a left femur, it's complete, it's from a mature animal, and this length is 90 centimeters long. So that data is compiled with all the other data to give a picture of the diet of the people. So here's a compilation of that. Land mammals, marine mammals, birds, fish, snails and clams. And this breaks down into elements. These are the number of bones that were identified. And of the land mammals, hoary marmots were the highest, probably important for fur as well as for food, but mainly for fur. But for food, of the marine mammals, seals, porpoises, and whales figure prominently. Only 9 whales, only 5 whales, but we'll see that they become very important when you add the meat weight of a whale. Birds and fish and so on. So we get a stamp, so to speak, of the diet, at least of the diet that was brought back to the site and consumed at the site. There's some of it that could have been consumed away from the site, but this being the diet that we know of from the site, minus the land or the sea plants and the land plants, which would have been important. So the way you present faunal information, here's just number of individuals. This is raw counts. So shellfish are by far the highest. Fish, birds, marine mammals, land mammals kind of trail out. But if you look at it in terms of meat weight, and you take the number of individuals times the meat weight of the sample, of a whale, of a seal, of a porpoise. Now whales are the highest, because whales, of course, are large, and there would have been a lot of usable meat weight on one whale. Even though there weren't many whales, they contribute a lot to the diet. And then it's strung out with seals, porpoise, shellfish, fish, and marmots. So those of you who are interested, you can track. It's called minimum number of individuals and meat weight, and there are calculations by which you can figure this out if you have the original data. But either way, it gives us an idea of what they were eating and why we call them the marine Kachemak tradition. So to summarize, so we know it existed from about 1000 BC to 600 to 1000 AD, somewhere in there. Kachemak Bay, the outer Kenai coast, Kodiak, Prince William Sound, parts of the Alaska Peninsula. That's the area. It's a marine adaptation. We know from the artifacts, we know from the location of the sites, and we know from the food that they were eating. Key artifacts being harpoons, ulus, lamps, jewelry, and rock paintings, among others. Probably were ancestral Alutiiq or Sugpiaq speakers. Probably were derived from the Ocean Bay tradition. Either way, we're pretty sure they're not Dena'ina. We're pretty sure that they were related to the Eskimo Aleut peoples of coastal traditions, although we're still working that out. But there's such a strong break between this group culturally and the Dena'ina that would have been a very surprising transition to make. So that's the marine Kachemak tradition, and thank you very much.